I'm tickling you all for free. The least you could do is subscribe. This case takes place in the USA in the 1990s. A young woman stepped out of her morning shower, totally oblivious to the demonic gaze fixed upon her from inside her own room. Steam was still rising softly from her wet skin as she reached for a towel. She believed she was alone. She wasn't. In mere moments, neighbours heard the sound of a dull thud of a body hitting the floor and the sharp cry of a scream. And then, utter silence. She was one of 6 victims. This is the case of the Claremont killer. 20-year-old Tiffany Schultz had everything to live for. Born into a respected family in Northern California, Tiffany had moved to San Diego full of ambition, drawn by dreams of studying literature at the San Diego State University. Friends remembered her as bright and compassionate, but beneath Tiffany's cheerful exterior was a hidden struggle. Financial pressures had pushed her into a job that she didn't want to do, exotic dancing at a local club. It was something that she spoke about often. She described it as a necessary evil, merely a stepping stone towards her ultimate dream of becoming an English professor. Her life was further complicated by her turbulent relationship with Christopher Burns, who was her 28-year-old boyfriend. The two would often argue about her job, and he could even get violent. Neighbours had become accustomed to hearing raised voices coming from Tiffany's apartment, punctuated occasionally by the sound of slamming doors and muffled cries. But despite all of this, Tiffany was determined to reclaim her independence. She planned a future for herself, free from fear or compromise. However, someone else had plans for Tiffany. Plans far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. On the 12th of January 1990, San Diego awoke to a clear, bright winter morning. At around 10 a.m., Tiffany was alone inside her second-floor apartment on Cowley Way. She had been out on her balcony, but someone had been watching from a distance, carefully noting her routine and captivated by her vulnerability. That same someone approached her apartment silently, unnoticed. He moved quietly up the stairs towards her open door. Moments later, Tiffany stepped inside from the balcony, preparing for a shower. She casually tossed aside her clothing, unaware that every movement she made was being watched from within her home. As Tiffany stood beneath the shower, the attacker moved silently to the kitchen, carefully selecting a large and sharp knife from the drawer. Armed and without hesitation, he approached the bathroom, driven by dark impulses beyond comprehension. As Tiffany exited the shower in a room full of steam, she never had a chance. In a frenzy of violence, the attacker stabbed her repeatedly, 47 times to be exact, each thrust delivered with a calculated precision that revealed a horrifying obsession with the heart. The blade punctured her chest repeatedly, piercing vital organs, leaving no doubt about the attacker's intent. He wanted Tiffany dead beyond all doubt, leaving nothing to chance. Blood sprayed across the walls, pooled on the tile floor, and stained the soft carpet, painting a grotesque portrait of uncontrolled brutality. Outside, neighbours later recalled hearing an unsettling scream, which was abruptly cut short, followed by a dull thud. But they dismissed it as just another argument between Tiffany and her boyfriend, and so no one called the police. Hours later, her boyfriend Christopher came into the apartment and discovered Tiffany dead. By the time authorities arrived at the scene, hours had passed. San Diego officers noted that this was no typical murder. Suspicion naturally fell upon her boyfriend Christopher, whose violent history with Tiffany seemed to fit perfectly with the crime. Within hours, Christopher was in custody, vehemently protesting his innocence as detectives pressed harder for a confession. But 3 days later, the evidence cleared Christopher. There were no fingerprints linking him to the murder weapon, and at the time of the murder, he was nowhere near the apartment, and so he was free to go, which left the San Diego police with a chilling realization. The killer was still out there. The police were worried that he would be free to kill again, and kill again he did. Just 1 month later, On the 16th of February 1990, another promising young woman's life was snuffed out in Claremont, just blocks away from Tiffany's home. 21-year-old Janine Weinhold. Janine had her whole future mapped out, with dreams of becoming a lawyer. She was fiercely independent, proudly living alone and decorating her apartment. Friends admired her determination, intelligence, and endless positivity. On that fateful Friday, Janine spent her morning quietly baking cookies and folding laundry. But once again, just like the last time, a shadowy figure lingered nearby, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Shortly after noon, the attacker crept silently into her unlocked apartment, catching Janine entirely unaware. By the time that Janine's roommate arrived later that day, the bright and welcoming apartment had been transformed into a scene of a nightmare. Janine lay sprawled on her bedroom floor, stabbed more than 30 times in the chest. Once again, clustered grotesquely around her heart, almost ritualistic in their precision. She had fought fiercely, with defensive wounds clearly visible on her arms and hands. Blood soaked her clothing, drenched her textbooks, and splattered the walls. Tragically, the attacker didn't just stop at murder. Evidence at the scene revealed that she had been SA'd, leaving behind critical DNA evidence which would later prove invaluable to the police. But at that moment, there were no immediate answers as to who had done this. And with now 2 brutal murders merely weeks apart, panic gripped Claremont. The police began warning residents to lock their doors no matter what time of the day it was. Caution gripped the streets as women avoided going out alone late at night. But the killer wasn't deterred. On the 3rd of April 1990, another chillingly similar case shook San Diego once again. 18-year-old Holly Tarr had travelled from her Michigan hometown to visit her older brother, Richard, in San Diego for spring break. On that warm April afternoon, Holly took a leisurely shower after being by the pool, not knowing that she had left the door to her brother's apartment unlocked. Quiet footsteps crept inside, moving steadily toward the bathroom, clutching another stolen kitchen knife tightly in hand. Unlike the others, this was not a prolonged attack. This time, the attacker struck swiftly. The killer delivered just one decisive stab directly into Holly's heart. The precision was surgical, horrifyingly effective, leaving no chance of survival. In his haste to escape, the killer encountered a maintenance worker alerted by the commotion. The two briefly grappled, but the attacker was able to slip away, leaving behind only a discarded blooded knife in a nearby alley. Another clue in an escalating chain of violent murders. The murders had now formed a clear pattern, sending shockwaves through San Diego. 3 young women were stabbed to death within months, each killed inside their homes, each time involving knives from their kitchen. The unknown killer had the city held captive by fear. The police desperately increased patrols, went door to door asking for tips, but the attacker eluded capture, and he grew bolder. In May of 1990, the killer would strike again. This time, it was across town in East San Diego, which surprised the authorities. 38-year-old mother Alyssa Keller lived alone with her daughter Michelle, who just so happened to be away on a school trip. Alyssa was violently attacked at night in her apartment, stabbed repeatedly in a frenzy of unimaginable brutality. Even her eyes were viciously slashed, disfiguring her beyond recognition. The attacker stole her jewelry before leaving, but they left behind a clear sneaker print. This was a crucial clue, but still not enough to identify him. Michelle returned the following night, discovering her mother's lifeless, blood-soaked body hidden beneath a blanket. It was a horror that would haunt her forever. The police scrambled to connect this crime to the Clairemont killings, and they hoped that they could stop whoever had done this before they would strike again. But tragically, they failed to achieve this. The final horror struck months later, on the 13th of September 1990, when 42-year-old Pamela Clark and her 18-year-old daughter Amber were brutally murdered inside their home. On the morning of the 13th of September 1990, Pamela left her home at around 8 a.m. to go to the gym, while Amber remained at home still asleep. At around 10 a.m., neighbours overheard Amber's frightened voice, followed by the voice of an unknown man. Moments later, a piercing scream rang out, then abruptly fell silent. Disturbingly, the neighbours dismissed the commotion as a family dispute, and no one called the police. This is surprisingly common in true crime cases, and is put down to the bystander effect. At around 11 a.m., Pamela returned home completely unaware of the danger inside. Upon entering, she saw her daughter dead on the floor. But before she could comprehend what had gone on, Pamela was immediately attacked. She suffered 11 stab wounds to the upper chest, closely grouped around her heart, and her daughter Amber had met a similar fate. She too had been stabbed in the chest 11 times, with wounds concentrated again around the heart. The knife used in the attack was thrust with such force that it broke, leaving the blade lying on the bathroom floor. Amber's body had been moved after her death, positioned deliberately in the doorway between her bedroom and the hallway. She was unclothed, with her legs open. Pamela's body was also dragged and placed in the entryway of the home. She was unclothed and positioned just like her daughter. The mother and daughter were later found by the police, who described the scene as something straight out of a horror movie. With 6 murders in just 9 months, and each disturbingly similar, the public demanded answers. But answers were in desperately short supply. The killer was meticulous, calculating and careful, never leaving fingerprints or obvious clues. In desperation, San Diego police turned to criminal profiling experts, hoping psychology might offer insights that forensics simply couldn't. Experts described the killer as likely young, physically capable, and familiar with the neighborhoods that he operated in. They warned authorities that his compulsion for violence was escalating. In response, neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight. Detectives also interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, neighbors, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances of each victim. Thousands of hours of security footage from nearby businesses, apartment complex, and local stores were reviewed. Tip lines buzzed continuously. Every caller was vetted, and every lead was explored. But as time went on, people were losing hope, until a breakthrough finally arrived from an unexpected source. On the 3rd of February 1991, nearly a full year after Tiffany's murder, an alert from a resident changed everything. Late in the evening, a neighbor in the Scripps Ranch neighborhood noticed something suspicious. A blue Nissan lingered suspiciously outside her neighbor's home, driven by an unfamiliar young man who appeared to be fixated on the property. The man approached the young woman's house and tried to get inside. Disturbed by his odd behavior, she discreetly noted the vehicle's license plate number as he drove away. Her decision to call the police sparked a rapid sequence of events that would finally crack the case wide open. Within hours, the San Diego Police Department traced the vehicle's registration, revealing it belonged to a local resident, a man previously unknown to the authorities, Cleophas Prince Jr. Cleophas was born on the 24th of July 1967 in Birmingham, Alabama. His childhood was unstable and marked by poverty and violence. When he was just 3, his father went to prison for second-degree murder and served 14 years of a 40-year sentence. Cleophas grew up in one of Birmingham's roughest neighborhoods, where crime was extremely common. In school, he was described as quiet, introverted, and viewed by teachers as an underachiever. It was in his teenage years where he turned to petty crime, such as vandalism and shoplifting. He eventually dropped out of high school without any notice. At 19, he joined the Navy, but he was soon discharged for theft. In late 1989, he moved to Claremont with his girlfriend, Charla Lewis. Neighbours knew him as quiet, polite, and physically fit. But now, the police were onto him. They linked him to an attempted crime which matched all of the previous murders. Quietly, without alerting him, detectives immediately installed surveillance. On the 4th of February 1991, the police discreetly arrested Cleophas in the parking lot of a gym. Initially, he was detained for an outstanding traffic warrant, enabling detectives to question him without prematurely revealing their suspicion of murder. Cleophas remained calm, denied any involvement, and the police had to reluctantly release him as they were wary of tipping their hand without sufficient evidence. However, they continued close surveillance. But Cleophas wasn't stupid. Feeling increasingly concerned, Cleophas fled California abruptly, returning home to Alabama. But the detectives were now closing in on Cleophas and started building a concrete case. They carefully linked his presence, vehicle, and patterns to each crime. Witnesses soon emerged, identifying him as the suspicious individual observed near multiple murder sites. Once the police had enough evidence, they set out a warrant for his arrest. In early March of 1991, Cleophas Prince was arrested in Birmingham, but initially he was detained for a petty theft. That was until the Birmingham police realised who they had in custody and that he was wanted for 6 murders. Under court orders, Cleophas was forced to submit DNA samples, blood, saliva, and hair. The resulting tests provided the breakthrough that the detectives had desperately awaited. Cleophas's DNA matched perfectly to the semen recovered from Janine Weinhold's crime scene. The odds of error were virtually impossible. Finally, after months of intense fear, grief, and uncertainty, San Diego police knew without any doubt that they had captured the serial killer who terrorized their city. When detectives confronted Cleophas with the forensic results, he continued to deny everything. His demeanor was cold and dismissive, but for police, his denial no longer mattered. The evidence was extremely overwhelming, and this is where things get even more disturbing. The police found the jewelry that was stolen from the victims, and they found it in Cleophas's girlfriend's jewelry drawer. He had gifted the jewelry as a Christmas present. His girlfriend Carla was unknowingly wearing the jewelry of murder victims. Then the police found even more evidence. Everyone walks differently, and so everyone, after wearing their shoes for a while, has a distinctive footprint. Footprints matching his distinctive sneaker pattern further confirmed his guilt beyond question. On the 4th of March 1991, San Diego authorities charged Cleophas with 6 counts of murder. San Diego could finally begin healing, knowing that their streets were safer, though haunted by the memories of a predator who had once stalked them. The trial began in June of 1993, and quickly became one of San Diego's most high-profile and emotionally charged court cases. Cleophas faced 27 charges, including 6 counts of first-degree murder, SA, burglary, along other offences. The courtroom was filled with grieving families, journalists, and heightened security. The lead prosecutor presented a detailed and graphic account of each crime. Jurors were confronted with disturbing forensic evidence, including graphic crime scene photographs. They were also presented the damning evidence tying Cleophas directly to stolen jewelry, which belonged to the victims, and how he brazenly gifted these items to his unsuspected girlfriend. To say the evidence was overwhelming would be an understatement. Victim impact statements from families also devastated the jurors. The parents spoke movingly about their lost daughters, highlighting their bright futures that were brutally taken. Several jurors openly wept as parents described their ongoing trauma and emptiness left behind by their daughters' murders. In contrast, the defense faced enormous challenges. They argued that Cleophas was wrongly accused due to circumstantial evidence, mistaken identity, and desperation on the investigators' behalf. The defense suggested that the police had mishandled evidence and prematurely narrowed their focus onto Cleophas without adequately pursuing other leads. However, of course, their arguments were severely weakened by the prosecution's compelling forensic evidence, eyewitness identifications, DNA proof, and incriminating stolen items. Throughout the trial, it's reported that Cleophas displayed a detached demeanor, rarely expressing emotion or engaging directly. He frequently scribbled on a notepad or whispered briefly to his attorneys. His distant attitude did little to endear him to jurors already distressed by the graphic testimony and vivid portrayals of his disturbing crimes. After months of testimony, the jury began deliberations in early July of 1993. On the 13th of July, they returned their verdict. Guilty on all 27 counts. Cleophas was convicted of 6 murders with special circumstances, leaving him eligible for the death penalty. As the verdict was read aloud, Cleophas remained emotionless, staring straight ahead. His mother, Dorothy Prince, however, cried out in anguish and briefly collapsed, overwhelmed by the verdict. The prosecutors pushed for capital punishment, citing the extreme cruelty, violence, and the predatory nature of Cleophas's crimes. In a chilling final statement to the court, Cleophas briefly addressed the families. He continued to deny responsibility, expressing sympathy for the families, but not remorse. He just told them that he never did it. This only angered the victims' families further. On the 5th of November 1993, the judge formally sentenced him to death, emphasizing the uniquely horrific and calculated brutality of the murders. Cleophas just shook his head briefly. As he was led away from the courtroom, a relative of one of the victims shouted at him to rot in hell, and with that, the court proceedings ended, offering some measure of closure for the victims' families, but leaving lasting scars on the entire San Diego community. To honor the victims, community initiatives sprang up across San Diego. Playgrounds, scholarship awards, and memorial plaques commemorated the lives tragically lost. The legal aftermath dragged on through numerous appeals filed by Cleophas's defense team. They challenged everything from the DNA to claiming that the trial was biased. However, in 2007, the California Supreme Court unanimously upheld his convictions and the death sentence. So where is he now? Well, despite being sentenced to death, he remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison today, and due to recent changes in legislation, it's unlikely that he will ever be executed. Now in his late 50s, Cleophas continues serving his sentence, and though decades have passed, San Diego has never forgotten the horror inflicted by the man forever remembered as the Claremont killer. To this day, Cleophas Prince Jr. has never admitted to the murders he committed, still protesting that he is innocent.